It is my great pleasure to welcome Helen Rozwadowski, a fantastic scholar, a historian of oceanography and deep-sea dredging. And if she'd like to see if I can get this back up. If you'd like to join me in welcoming her to San Diego.
Before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank John for all his hard work. And I have to say, Christian, I did suggest your name and a few others, and then I completely ignored the whole thing while Superstorm Sandy hit and a few other things were keeping me busy. And I think I put my faith in good hands. And I also wanted to just say what a pleasure it is to be back at Scripps. I had to look it up, but I was here in 2001 giving some talks when I was a Ritter Fellow here. And it's very wonderful to be back. All right. Not sure how to do this part. Yeah, here it is. Got it. It's my bad eyesight. Oh, right there. Got it. All right. So, here we go. So most people, I think, consider the ocean as a constant and timeless place, and it's easy to understand why. Looking out over the surface of the ocean, one sees restless waves or big waves, one smells the salt breeze. One can imagine that one is seeing exactly the same ocean as observers either on a coast or on a ship from generations past. Ships leave no tracks. Differences under the surface of the ocean are not apparent. And in spite of all this, we know, or at least we should know, that the ocean is no less susceptible to change than is the land. Recent research informs us that the ocean has changed, continues to change, in many cases for the worst, in response to human actions. Anthropogenically induced climate change is changing ocean temperature, acidity, sea level. Overfishing and bottom trawling have profoundly changed ecosystems. Oil offshore drilling operations for oil and gas are marching into deeper and deeper waters, whereas areas near land are becoming dead zones in some places due to nutrient pollution. Much, perhaps most of the rhetoric and analysis associated with environmental crises of the ocean is presented by scientists and policy people. The very best science and technology is essential for addressing these kinds of problems. There is, however, and that's what I'm here to talk about today, I argue a central and a critical role for the humanities in identifying problems and devising solutions. So as you could see from my title, my goal today is to address three questions: why the humanities, why history, and why history of science. In other words, what can the humanities contribute to our understanding of the relationship between people and oceans? Why is it important to chronicle the historical dimension of that relationship, to understand when, how, and why people use the ocean for various different reasons at various times? And finally, what can the field of history of science bring to the table? And I'll give you a quick preview of that one. The ocean is a challenging place to know. To most of us, it is a two-dimensional surface that resists permanent marks. The ocean can reshape the shore, as those of us from the East Coast have recently been reminded. But the ocean itself, from a surface perspective, appears to be quite impervious to human activity. The ocean is also vast, so that efforts to comprehend it are either limited to a small little corner or involve systematic, coordinated operations. The ocean is also opaque, frustrating our human sense of sight, which is so very important to how we understand the land. These characteristics, opacity, tracklessness, and vast scale, profoundly influence how people have created knowledge about the ocean. And what the history of science is good at is studying the creation of knowledge about the natural world. And so that is what I'll be talking about when I get to that point. All right. The humanities, where I'll start, provide insight into the fundamental quandary of the ocean's apparent timelessness. This is important because it is I think, the timelessness that we associate with the ocean that makes it very hard for us to reconcile our understanding what seems to be the reality of the ocean as a place of dramatic change. Western culture does indeed perceive the ocean as a timeless place. I'm certainly not the only person to pull out this quote to demonstrate, to sort of encapsulate this fact. Henry David Thoreau put it this way: "We do not associate the idea of antiquity with the ocean, nor wonder how we do of land, nor wonder how it looked 1,000 years ago, as we do of the land. For it was equally wild and unfathomable always." And Thoreau does reflect the widespread cultural perception that the ocean is somehow different from land. He continued, "The Indians left no trace on the surface, but it is the same to the civilized man and the savage. The aspect of the shore only has changed." I invite you to pick up an anthology of writings about the sea and look for other examples. You will find many. In this association of the ocean with the ocean as a timeless place has continued into the 20th century. In 1994, the landscape historian John Stilgoe declared, "The sea is empty of history, utterly without a past." Now, as a diagnosis of our cultural perception of the sea, he's right. As an accurate understanding of the ocean environment himself, that's not correct. So while I was working on my dissertation, I had an experience that crystallized the need for me, the need for historians to write histories of the ocean, and I was lucky enough to spend time at the Smithsonian to have this great experience. I was asked to write a review of an environmental exhibit about the ocean that was specifically activist. It was designed to spur visitors to take action to protect the ocean. The interactive elements of the exhibit were very good at conveying information and very convincing about the need to do something about the environmental crisis of the ocean. But the exhibit creators also wanted to move beyond science and environmentalism, so they created this other section where they focused on timeless and cross-cultural connections between people and oceans. So, for example, they showed examples from traditional and industrial fisheries of various memorials for fishermen. While there are absolutely similarities of experience for all fishermen, I thought this section in the exhibit worked in tension with the goal of the exhibit. This section of the exhibit conveyed a sense of timelessness, whereas what the exhibit was trying to do was convey a sense of urgency and timeliness. The more I studied environmental history, which was a very terrestrial enterprise at the start of my career, the more I realized that we need humanities to historicize the ocean before we're going to be successful as a culture at taking action to protect our oceans the way we have already long since taken action to protect land, air, and inland water. My first foray into ocean history was an investigation of the ocean's third dimension in the 19th century. Rather than finding a story about increased knowledge of a realm very apart from the human world, I found that the ocean's depths were very tightly connected to American and British culture, to politics and economics through the submarine telegraph cable, to novels, science, recreation, travel, gender roles, to imperialism and the extension of national power, and so on. So instead of writing a story about the development of interest in the ocean and the deep ocean, using the ocean itself as kind of a backdrop or a stage, as a lot of maritime history tends to do, I discovered that the ocean really mattered to my story, and in turn that people's actions and changing ideas about the ocean transformed the sea. The humanities, I believe, help make it possible to deal with this characteristic of the ocean of tracklessness. Unlike the wagon wheels of settlers who traverse the Oregon Trail, the wake of boats is ephemeral. Ordinary visitors, viewers of the sea's surface, can't see the past etched on the ocean's surface the way we often can of land. Whereas physical and chemical oceanographers can render the vast trackless ocean comprehensible by measuring minute temperature differences and by measuring minute amounts of particles, historians can use archival and other sources to recover activities that took place on and in oceans, activities which became invisible as soon as the wake settled out. So why history? The story of our human relationship with the ocean is a very long one, reaching back into evolutionary time. People have used the ocean for many reasons, starting with food and transportation, but also as the focus for myth and culture. Recent scholarship in history, historical ecology, and underwater archaeology has dramatically extended our awareness of the degree to which people relied on the ocean and the degree to which people affected the ocean over a long period of time. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a few examples from prehistory, which will surprise those of you who think I'm working on the 1950s and 60s right now, which I also am. And I've made this choice precisely because the length and intensity of the human interactions with the sea have been forgotten or obscured by more than a century of very terrestrially oriented scholarship. When humans evolved, they did so in a world that was that included the ocean as well as land. However, until recently, archaeologists understood that Homo sapiens and its ancestors were fundamentally terrestrial and turned to the sea only relatively recently in the evolution of Homo sapiens. But now scholars of prehistory are discovering earlier evidence than ever before of human voyaging and of human reliance on marine food resources. So I take you to the tiny island of Flores off the east coast of Java, the Java island of Indonesia, where a hominid species arrived 1 million years ago in the era known as the early Pleistocene. To offer some perspective, Homo sapiens showed up in this area sometime between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago. The fossils discovered at Flores so far reveal hominids similar in body size and cranial capacity to Australopithecine, an earlier hominid thought to have been confined to Africa. Archaeologists have concluded from their fossil discoveries that this represents a new species. Experts are not sure whether the immigrants that arrived in Flores were Homo erectus that subsequently evolved to a smaller body size because of a calorie-poor environment, or whether they were in the first place a small-bodied unknown species. Either way, the implications for prehistory are staggering. Archaeologists wonder at the thought that we shared our planet with other hominid species much, much more recently than we thought. To me, this discovery is exciting for another reason. Even at times of the lowest sea levels, travel to Flores would have required crossing a deep sea barrier of 25 kilometers, which was beyond the dispersal abilities of most of the land animals. The presence of these hominids on this otherwise inaccessible island, then, provides indirect evidence of the oldest human maritime technology in the world. Previously, scholars have thought that the organizational and linguistic abilities to undertake sea voyaging appeared first in modern humans and only late in the Pleistocene. Similarly, other research is causing us to look far back to find the start of human reliance on marine resources. Before the discovery I'll describe next, the oldest evidence we had for people eating shellfish and living in coastal areas was about 125,000 years ago. Agriculture, just to offer a point of comparison, 10,000 years ago. An archaeological discovery in a South African cave near Mossel Bay revealed a group of humans there relying on shellfish at a very critical time 164,000 years ago, when harsh environmental conditions caused by glaciation may have forced them finally to exploit new food resources. The evidence of shellfish eating was found in conjunction with evidence of symbolic behavior and with technologies that together signaled to experts that these early humans displayed key elements of what's considered modern behavior. The time and place of this find corresponds to a bottleneck in human evolution, and an archaeologist involved in the study has remarked that this particular group of people, quote, could be the progenitor population for all modern humans. But there is no need to rely on the drama of an evolutionary bottleneck. Archaeologist John Erlandson has concluded that wherever aquatic resources were abundant and relatively accessible, they have likely always been used opportunistically by our ancestors. To which I would add, why should that be surprising, since shellfish are delicious? The geography of the Mossel Bay Sea Cave is unusual. It stands at a high enough elevation to have survived inundation from rising sea levels that followed the last round of retreat of glaciers. That suggests, Okay, that's that. There we go. That suggests that most of the potential places people have lived, might have lived in near coasts, are now somewhat out of reach of the traditional methods of archaeology. And indeed, innovators are striving to develop tools and methods for a new field of underwater archaeology, one that will be devoted to submerged sites of past human habitation. This new experimental field might someday completely rewrite our understanding of the relationship between people and oceans in terms of coastal voyaging, marine resource use, and coastal habitation. Another field is already dramatically revising our understanding of peoples and oceans. Historical ecologists working with historians have demonstrated numerous examples of overfishing and even of ecological extinction, which predate modern ecological investigations. To give you one example, the number of Caribbean sea turtles is now in the tens of thousands. A few centuries ago, it was in the tens of millions. There are quite a few important papers and books that document many case studies of pre-industrial exploitation of marine resources, leaving staggering effects on populations and on ecosystems. More recently, historical ecologists are teaming up with archaeologists to document anthropogenic effects on marine ecosystems reaching back thousands of years, such as here in the Channel Islands off California, and on Pacific Islands across Oceania in the late Holocene. I've chosen to focus this section of my talk about history on prehistory and deep history in order to make the point that the human relationship with the ocean started right at the beginning. The seas have apparently provided food and transportation as long as people have lived near coasts, however long that turns out to be. Modern humans evolved eating shellfish and living near coasts. I'm hardly an expert in these fields, but to me these discoveries are incredibly striking in the reminder they carry to us as historians that we must reorient our thinking about the ocean to be historical. Finally, history of science. The field of history of science is particularly suited to helping us understand the ocean as a place that has a history and as a place whose history is intertwined with human history. The history of science excels at helping us understand the creation of knowledge about the natural world, as I said before. Historians of science can study the intellectual development of a field or fields of science, but they also study the practice of science and the contexts, economic, political, social, and as I said in my comments, the ocean is a challenging place to know. So being able to study effectively the creation of knowledge about a place like this is pretty critical. So the characteristics that I mentioned before, opacity, tracklessness, vast scale, very much influence and constrain how people have known the ocean. These characteristics, I argue, mean that we can only know the ocean indirectly. I think that's pretty obvious. So here again, the methods and questions of history of science and also history of technology can help by calling our attention to both the technologies and the knowledge systems that enable people to learn about invisible currents and opaque depths. Knowledge of the ocean is necessarily mediated by technologies, tools, and skills of both people who work at sea, fishermen, navigators, people like that, and modern scientists. Indeed, the tools and skills are sometimes exactly the same. While fishermen, at least before and outside of industrial fisheries, tended to know well smaller parts of the ocean, governments began to seek knowledge about the ocean to support and the creation and extension of imperial power or economic power even before that, in fact. To achieve this, scientists and cartographers learned to create functional representations of the ocean, such as bathymetric charts, or Michael Reedy's, you saw that already before, tidal charts, charts of magnetic variation, I think we've seen before. So all of these representations render the knowledge of the ocean usable for travel, for trade, for the extension of power, and other activities. In the 20th century, these kind of technologies broadened to include underwater photography, computer models, many other things. The real question, so maybe that part we've seen before, why do we need to understand the creation of knowledge about the ocean? Because every use of the ocean involved knowledge creation in order to achieve that use. Non-historians of science would take as their subject various uses of the ocean like this, transportation, war, things like that. They would tend to relegate the knowledge creation implicit in those activities to kind of a black box. Historians of science, by contrast, would start by going to that black box and opening it, and trying to understand the process of creating knowledge about the natural world that allowed these activities to take place. Let me give you an example from my research on the history of the deep sea in the mid-19th century. During the 1850s and 60s, a series of efforts were made to lay telegraph cables across the Atlantic to connect essentially Britain to the United States. Historians of these efforts have highlighted noteworthy aspects of this project, especially the incredible technological innovation these efforts represented, and also very much the geopolitical implications. These historians have generally treated the ocean as an inert medium and asked questions and did not ask questions about the creation of knowledge about the ocean necessary to lay these cables, nor have they taken the ocean seriously as a geographic place intertwined with historical change. In short, they wrote histories of cable laying and not histories of the ocean. As a history of science, when I began my research, I first looked for evidence of people surveying or otherwise trying to understand the ocean into which these cables were going to be installed. One senior historian told me that there were no surveys done before the laying of the Atlantic cable, which I doubted, and I was right. I mean, I'm too much of a historian of technology. No entrepreneurs would make that kind of investment without doing a little research. I eventually found information about many surveys, including of different proposed routes, including the route eventually taken, the Great Circle route. By asking typical history of science questions about the practice and technologies of science, about its funding, and about the relationship of the effort to find out about the ocean in the context of the uses intended for the ocean, a new historical understanding of the ocean came into focus for me. I began to understand that navigators in the open ocean in the period before this were interested in ruling out shallowness. They were not interested in measuring depth precisely. That was reserved for areas near land. For a variety of reasons, which quickly expanded to include submarine telegraphy, efforts began to be made to explore the bathymetric dimensions of the North Atlantic Basin. In other words, there was a shift from ruling out shallowness to measuring depth. The resulting understanding of the seafloor, including pictures you see here, certainly reflected state-of-the-art technology and skill. But equally, I discovered, reflected people's intentions for using the ocean to hold the telegraph. And I just point out to you the wistful telegraph plateau image, which is the result of state-of-the-art science and technology and maybe a little desire. So in short, my history expanded from a history of submarine telegraphy to being, in part, a contribution to a history of the ocean. So this discovery offers one more answer to the question of why history of science, or why the humanities even more broadly. As the submarine telegraphy episode demonstrates, the methods and questions of the history of science remind us that we know the oceans, in fact, as much through imagination as we do through technology, skills, and knowledge systems. The opacity of the ocean, in fact, guarantees that we see reflected back our own desires and our own fears. And I think that is very clear if you start looking in the 20th century. Metaphors such as wilderness or frontier reveal the cultures and times of the people who deploy them, and wilderness became a central metaphor for American understanding of the ocean during the 20th century, according to Gary Kroll, whose book I have included the cover of here. Identification of the ocean as a frontier in the post-World War II period reinforced beliefs about the limitless of the ocean's resources and extended that myth in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. The frontier metaphor applied to the ocean formed, in fact, a self-fulfilling prophecy that established and encouraged certain habits and attitudes about using the ocean. The frontier metaphor became entrenched and pervasive in post-World War II thinking and writing about the ocean. And I'm going to read you a quote from a person who was an engineer, but also a popular writer, and a founder of a technical journal in ocean engineering with the great name Seabrook Hull. Of the two great frontiers, space and the ocean, being opened up in the 20th century, only the ocean is close, tangible, and of direct personal significance to every man, woman, or child on the face of the globe. Another war might be won or lost in its depths, rather than in outer space. It is a cornucopia of raw materials for man's industries, food for his stomach, health for his body, challenges to his mind, and inspiration to his soul. What kind of frontier was the ocean? From the quote, we can see that it's going to offer food, other kind of tangible economic things. It's going to promote industrial development, but it's also going to satisfy intellectual and spiritual needs. And to those of you with a certain amount of history training, you might just recognize some echoes of the famous frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner, articulated at the end of the 19th century. Just at the moment that the Census Bureau had declared the American western frontier to be closed. By the time post-war ocean boosters embraced the frontier metaphor, it was generally out of fashion among the community of professional historians, but that did nothing to diminish its by then established cultural power. And labeling the ocean as a frontier seemed to have promoted an understanding of the sea's resources as being, as I mentioned, practically speaking, limitless. You see all these books all coming out within a few years of each other. In spite of several spectacular and carefully watched fish stock crashes in Europe, fishery scientists insisted that while particular stocks here and there might be a little affected by overfishing, in general, if you're talking about the open ocean, fish are more or less limitless, and we operated that way in the 1960s and 70s. Long after environmentalists worried about the effects of a wide range of pollutants on land, marine chemists reassured governments that as far as the open sea was concerned, the solution to pollution is dilution. And those two examples are from my research on the history of ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. Tremendous confidence that the open ocean was essentially a limitless place. Labeling the ocean as a frontier may have contributed to the incredibly long delay in recognizing the ocean as an environment susceptible to human action. Attention to marine environmental issues has lagged similar attention to land by at least a century. Only since the mid-1990s has the ocean's environmental status gripped the mainstream media and ordinary people, and I think this has happened for two reasons. The first in time was the shocking closure of the North Atlantic fisheries in the 1990s, followed by the absolutely unthinkable failure of the stocks to recover, as everyone expected they would, when fishing pressure was removed. Second has been the debate over global climate change. Whoops, I don't have a slide for that. Because of the central role of the ocean in the catalog of global effects we can expect from climate change, and also because of the potential role of the ocean in ambitious ideas of geoengineering for fixing our problems. One benchmark of this new marine environmental awareness might be the call by marine ecologist and Carl Safina to develop a sea ethic in parallel to Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Leopold studied forestry and worked in the Forest Service at a time when eradicating predators was his job. He described a personal moment of conversion when he rejected the supposed need to eradicate predators, recognizing the ecological role played by all living creatures. Leopold went on to found the Wilderness Society and to articulate a radical and controversial moral principle, which he called the land ethic. This principle recognizes the right of the natural world to exist regardless of its utility for humans. Leopold's moral call to arms had a profound effect on the formal environmental movement, although it did nothing, maybe because of his terrestrial orientation, to make the environmental movement a little more attentive to the ocean. And ethics is, of course, another area that could form the subject of another talk in the area of humanities. But what I've tried to do here is to talk about how history, and in particular history of science, can contribute to historicizing the ocean by pointing out the critical role of human intentions, desires, and ideas in creating knowledge about and in forging actual uses of the ocean. Until we learn about the ocean's past and our inextricable connection to it, we will not make much headway in changing our relationship with the ocean for the better. But I think the frontier metaphor holds out some hope. We need to find a way to jettison our perception of the ocean as a timeless place and replace it with an understanding of the sea as one bound to history and tied to humanity. That kind of a new vision with new metaphors can form the foundation for positive change. Thank you. Are there any comments or questions? More of a comment paper than a question paper. Yes.
I have a comment soft question. Something I've been thinking about lately, especially with the deep sea exploration that's been going on with James Cameron. He did a movie for Disney that directly linked underwater exploration to space exploration. This is kind of the way that he's drawing in viewers. It's just like, it's almost like going to the moon.
Right.
And so I was just wondering, how do you think it might be possible to kind of uncouple that idea of the ocean as like
space? It's going to be hard going because that's exactly what happened in the 1950s and 60s. And the project I'm working on, the history of undersea exploration. So I agree with your sense that it would be ideal to uncouple it because, you know, there are some analogies, but I don't think the analogies are as good as the damage that the metaphor does. I mean, so I think I agree with you there. Yes, John.
I wonder if you followed the recent, you know, there's a development of this thing called the Ocean Health Index. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of an important step. I mean, you know, it's a metric basically saying, how is the ocean doing in this particular place? You know, and sort of an evolution. But I wonder how that fits in with your...
I should look at the timing of that with regard to the, you know, Carl Safina and some of the other things that happened, because I don't know enough. Yeah.
There's a paper in the last few months basically that sort of brings it out. But it's an idea that you can take this forward.
Yeah.
You have a metric to say, how are we doing?
Right.
But it really relates to sort of human presence.
It does, and that is something that was true of the terrestrial environmental movement. I've now developed this entire, you know, that was a different environmental movement in some senses than this. You know, it really was about the ultimate effects for on human health in the end. And you know, to some extent that's important because it helps us relate to the ocean in a way, right? But I think, I mean, that's the Carl Safina insistence is we have to, if, you know, that may be part of it, but we have to also move beyond that and think about, you know, not just us. So thanks for that. Everyone's exhausted. We can be done. Thank you all for coming, but please let's thank John.
Thank you all for joining us. We'd like to thank SIO, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, for being a fantastic host. And thank you all for letting us share that perspective, that love of what people do here and the science of that ocean with you.